In a quiet corner of the countryside, far from the noise of bustling cities and crowded streets, there was a small cabin surrounded by tall trees and rolling hills. This wasn't just any cabin, it was Emma Carter's home. For years, Emma had lived there in peace, enjoying the simple pleasures of life that only someone who truly loves nature could understand. Her mornings began with birdsong, her afternoons were spent tending to her garden or fishing by the lake, and her evenings ended with breathtaking sunsets reflecting off the water. The lake was special. It wasn't big enough to attract tourists or boaters, but it was perfect for Emma. The surface shimmered like glass on calm days, and during storms, its waves danced wildly as if alive. Emma knew every inch of it, where the fish liked to hide, where the water lilies bloomed brightest, and even the exact spot where her father taught her how to skip stones when she was just a little girl. That lake held memories, laughter, and tears. It was more than just part of her property. It was part of her soul. But what most people didn't know, and Emma rarely mentioned, was that she owned not just the cabin, but also the entire lake bed. Yes, the whole thing. And not just the lake, the dock too. She'd inherited the land decades ago from her grandparents, who had bought it way before anyone else thought about building homes nearby. Back then it was nothing but wilderness, untouched and raw. Over time, though, things changed. New roads appeared, power lines stretched across the horizon, and eventually, subdivisions started popping up around her once secluded paradise. At first, Emma didn't mind the newcomers. She figured everyone deserved a chance to enjoy the beauty of the area. But soon those newcomers formed something called a homeowners association, or HOA for short. At first glance, the HOA seemed harmless, a group of neighbors working together to keep their community neat and tidy. They organized meetings, set rules, and made sure lawns were mowed and driveways cleared of snow. However, they weren't content with just managing their own properties. No, they wanted control over everything, including Emma's lake. It all started innocently enough. Letters began arriving in Emma's mailbox, addressed to resident rather than her name. These letters outlined rules she supposedly needed to follow. No loud music after 9 p.m., mandatory landscaping standards, and restrictions on boat usage. Emma read them, shook her head, and tossed them into the recycling bin without a second thought. After all, this was her property. How could anyone tell her what to do? Still, the letters kept coming. Then came warning notices, politely worded, at first but growing increasingly stern. Dear resident, one said, failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in legal action. Another added, please note that non-compliance will lead to further consequences. Emma couldn't believe what she was reading. Legal action? Consequences? For what? Living on land she'd owned long before these strangers moved in? Despite the growing tension, Emma tried to stay calm. She reminded herself that ignorance wasn't always malicious. Maybe the HOA simply didn't realize the lake belonged to her. Or perhaps they assumed she was fine sharing it since no one had objected earlier. Whatever the reason, she decided to give them the benefit of the doubt, for now. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the situation grew worse. Neighbors began treating her differently. Some avoided eye contact when passing her driveway, while others whispered behind her back. Rumors spread like wildfire. One neighbor claimed Emma was hoarding resources, refusing to let anyone else use the lake. Another accused her of being selfish, saying she cared more about her privacy than fostering a sense of community. None of it was true, of course, but hearing such things still stung. What bothered Emma most, though, was the sheer audacity of it all. Here she was, living quietly on land she'd owned for decades, and suddenly, strangers felt entitled to dictate how she should live her life. It was maddening. Still, she resisted the urge to confront them directly. Instead, she bided her time, waiting to see if the HOA would come to its senses. One day, while sorting through yet another pile of mail, Emma found a letter that stopped her cold. It wasn't like the others. This one wasn't polite or vaguely threatening. It was outright hostile. In bold letters, it stated that unless she complied with HOA rules within 30 days, they would take steps to evict her from her own property. Evict her. The very idea was laughable. Who did these people think they were? Emma sat down at her kitchen table, staring at the letter in disbelief. Anger bubbled inside her, but beneath that anger was something deeper: determination. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But Emma wasn't naive. She knew she couldn't face this alone. She needed help, someone who understood property law and could navigate the mess she was now caught up in. That's when she decided to call David Miller, a local lawyer known for his sharp mind and knack for winning tough cases. David specialized in property disputes, and his reputation spoke for itself. He was expensive, yes, but Emma figured it was worth every penny to protect what was hers. Their first meeting took place in David's office, a cozy room filled with shelves of legal books and framed certificates. Emma explained the situation, carefully laying out the timeline of events and showing him copies of the HOA letters. As she spoke, David listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting notes on a pad of paper. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This is unusual," he said finally, raising an eyebrow. "You're telling me you own the lake?" "Not just the lake," Emma replied firmly. "The dock, too. And wait, it gets better." She pulled out a folder containing deeds, surveys, and historical records proving her ownership. David flipped through them, his expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. "And the clubhouse?" he asked, almost hesitantly. Emma nodded. "Yep, that's mine too." David let out a low whistle. "Well, Emma," he said, leaning forward, "if what you're saying is true, then we've got quite the case on our hands." For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. With David by her side, she knew she stood a fighting chance against the HOA. But deep down, she also knew this wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was bound to be rocky, filled with twists and turns she couldn't predict. Still, one thing was certain: Emma wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The crisp autumn air carried a chill that seemed to seep into Emma's bones as she stood on her porch, staring at the certified letter in her hands. The golden leaves swirled around her feet, but her mind was far from the beauty of the season. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and read the words inside. It was official. The HOA had issued an ultimatum. If she didn't comply with their rules within 30 days, they would take legal action to evict her from her own home. The cabin she'd lived in for years, the land that had been in her family. For generations, Emma felt a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and even a hint of fear. How could this be happening? She had done nothing wrong. This wasn't just some random property dispute. It was her life, her history, her sanctuary. Yet here she was, being told by strangers that she needed to conform to their demands, or else. She sat down heavily on the wooden steps of her porch, clutching the letter tightly. For a moment, she let herself imagine giving in. What if she followed their rules? Would they leave her alone then? But almost immediately, she dismissed the thought. Giving in would mean surrendering not only her rights, but also her dignity. These people were trying to impose their will on something that didn't belong to them. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That's when Emma made up her mind. She wasn't going to roll over and play nice anymore. This was her land, her lake, and her legacy, and if the HOA wanted a fight, she was ready to give them one. The next morning, Emma drove into town to meet with David Miller, the lawyer she'd hired to help her navigate this mess. His office was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by towering oak trees whose branches stretched toward the sky like outstretched arms. Inside, the room was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and shelves lined with thick law books. David greeted her with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "So," he said, gesturing for her to sit, "tell me everything." Emma recounted the entire story, starting from the first letter she received from the HOA all the way to the latest threat of eviction. As she spoke, David listened intently, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. He asked questions here and there, clarifying details and making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Emma finished, There was a long pause before David finally leaned back in his chair. "This is complicated," he admitted, tapping his pen against the desk. "But not impossible. From what you've shown me, your ownership claims seem solid. The real challenge will be proving it to the HOA, and maybe even in court if it comes to that." Emma nodded grimly. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes." David smiled faintly. "Good, because we're going to need every bit of evidence we can get. Deeds, surveys, historical records, you name it. We'll build a case so strong, they won't have a leg to stand on." Over the next few weeks, Emma and David worked tirelessly to gather documentation. They dug through old files, tracked down survey maps, and even contacted local historians to verify the origins of her property. It was exhausting work, but Emma found solace in knowing she was fighting for something bigger than herself. Every piece of paper, every signature, every date confirmed what she already knew. This land was hers. As they pieced together the puzzle, Emma began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. For so long, she had kept quiet, hoping the HOA would lose interest or realize their mistake. But now she understood that silence wouldn't solve anything. Sometimes standing up for yourself meant making noise, even if it scared you. Meanwhile, tensions between Emma and her neighbors continued to escalate. Word spread quickly about her refusal to comply with the HOA's demands, and soon, whispers turned into outright hostility. Some neighbors avoided her altogether, while others glared at her whenever she passed by. A few even went out of their way to make snide comments. "You think you're better than us?" one man snapped during a chance encounter at the local grocery store. "You act like you own the place." Emma stopped in her tracks, gripping the handle of her shopping cart. For a moment she considered walking away, but something inside her pushed back. Turning to face him, she replied calmly, "Actually, I do own the place, or at least part of it." The man blinked, taken aback by her response. Before he could say anything else, Emma walked off, leaving him standing there with a stunned expression. It wasn't the first time someone had confronted her, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but each encounter only strengthened her resolve. She wasn't going to let anyone bully her into submission. Not now, not ever. Back at home, Emma spent hours poring over documents with David, strategizing their next move. One evening, as they sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, David looked up and said, "You know, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about setting a precedent. If we win, it'll send a message to other HOAs that they can't trample over people's rights." Emma nodded thoughtfully. She hadn't considered the broader implications of her fight until now. All she had wanted was to protect her home and her peace of mind. But perhaps in doing so, she could inspire others to stand up for themselves too. With that in mind, Emma decided to take a bold step. Instead of waiting for the HOA to make the next move, she would go on the offensive. At the next HOA meeting, she would present her case directly to the members. Let them see the truth for themselves. Let them understand exactly who they were dealing with. The night of the meeting arrived sooner than expected. Emma dressed simply but neatly, choosing a blouse and slacks that conveyed confidence without being overly formal. Clutching a folder filled with evidence, she walked into the community center where the HOA held its gatherings. The room was packed with neighbors, some curious, others hostile. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as they noticed her presence. Patricia Reeves, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room, presiding over the meeting with an air of authority. She frowned when she saw Emma approach the podium. "Can I help you?" she asked curtly. "Yes," Emma replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to clarify something important." For the next 10 minutes, Emma laid out her case. She showed copies of deeds proving her ownership of the lakebed, the dock, and, most shockingly, the very lot where the clubhouse stood. Gasps echoed through the room as neighbors exchanged bewildered looks. Patricia tried to interrupt, sputtering objections, but Emma remained composed, letting the facts speak for themselves. When she finished, the room fell silent. No one knew what to say. Some members whispered apologies, while others stared at her with newfound respect. But Patricia, red-faced and defiant, refused to back down. "We'll see you in court," she declared, slamming her gavel down. Emma didn't flinch. She had expected resistance, and she was ready for it. As she left the meeting, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Emma felt truly alive. The aftermath of Emma's bombshell announcement at the HOA meeting rippled through the community like a storm surge. Neighbors who had once dismissed her as a stubborn recluse now scrambled to make sense of what they'd just heard. Some whispered, in hushed tones, their faces pale with disbelief. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure whether to feel embarrassed, angry, or impressed. For many, the revelation hit like a punch to the gut. The lake they swam in, the dock they fished from, and even the clubhouse where they gathered for meetings, all of it belonged to Emma Carter. Patricia Reeves, the HOA president, looked as though she'd been struck by lightning. Her carefully styled hair seemed to bristle with indignation, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the gavel. She tried to regain control of the room, calling for order amidst the chaos. But her voice cracked under the weight of her own frustration. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed, slamming the gavel down again for emphasis. "We've been using this land for years. How could we not have known?" Emma stood calmly at the front of the room, her posture relaxed but confident. She didn't need to raise her voice or resort to theatrics. The evidence spoke louder than any argument she could make. With David Miller's guidance, she had prepared meticulously for this moment. Every document, every map, every detail was laid out clearly before them. There was no denying the truth. "This isn't about blame," Emma said evenly, addressing the crowd. "It's about facts. I've owned this property since long before the HOA existed. My grandparents bought this land decades ago, and it's been in my family ever since. You're welcome to review the records yourself if you don't believe me." Her tone wasn't accusatory or spiteful. It was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. Yet those simple words carried immense power. They forced everyone in the room to confront an uncomfortable reality. They had acted without knowing the full story. Worse still, they had assumed, wrongly, that Emma was just another homeowner subject to their rules. As the initial shock began to wear off, reactions among the HOA members varied wildly. A few neighbors approached Emma after the meeting, offering hesitant apologies. One woman named Linda, who lived 2 streets over, admitted sheepishly, "I had no idea things were so complicated. I'm sorry if we came across as pushy." Another man named Greg nodded in agreement, adding, "You've got every right to stand your ground. We should have looked into this more carefully before jumping to conclusions." But not everyone was willing to admit fault. Patricia remained steadfast in her denial, refusing to acknowledge the validity of Emma's claims. "Documents can be forged," she muttered to a small group of loyal supporters. "We can't take her word for it without proof." Her comments sparked murmurs of doubt among some attendees, fueling skepticism and division within the HOA ranks. Meanwhile, others grew increasingly uneasy. Mark Thompson, a middle-aged accountant who served as the HOA treasurer, voiced his concerns during a private discussion with Patricia later that evening. "Look, Pat," he said, rubbing his temples, "this doesn't look good for us. If what she's saying is true, and let's be honest, it seems pretty solid, we could be in serious trouble. Legal trouble, financial trouble, maybe even criminal charges for trespassing." Patricia waved him off dismissively. "Don't be dramatic, Mark, we'll handle this, we always do." But her bravado masked a growing unease. Deep down she knew Mark was right. The HOA's reputation, and perhaps its very existence, was on the line. Over the following days, the tension spilled beyond the confines of the HOA meetings and into the wider community. Conversations at the local coffee shop revolved around Emma and the unfolding drama. Some residents sympathized with her plight, praising her courage for standing up to the HOA. Others sided with the association, accusing Emma of being selfish and unreasonable. Social media exploded with heated debates, memes mocking both sides, and endless speculation about how the conflict would end. For Emma, the attention was overwhelming, but also strangely validating. For years, she had lived quietly, keeping to herself and avoiding confrontation. Now she found herself thrust into the spotlight, her name mentioned in every corner of the neighborhood. While some of the scrutiny was unpleasant, she couldn't deny the sense of empowerment that came with speaking her truth. David Miller encouraged her to stay focused. "Ignore the noise," he advised during one of their strategy sessions. "The court will decide based on the facts, not gossip or opinions. Our job is to present the strongest possible case." Together they continued gathering evidence, refining their arguments, and preparing for the inevitable legal battle. David filed a formal response to the HOA's eviction notice, attaching copies of Emma's deeds and survey maps. He also sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they halt all actions against Emma until the matter was resolved. Back at the HOA headquarters, a modest building that sat squarely on Emma's property, the atmosphere was tense. Board members convened emergency meetings to discuss their next steps. Patricia insisted on fighting back, convinced they could find loopholes or errors in Emma's documentation. "There has to be something we can use against her," she said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "No one owns a lake outright, it's public domain." Mark shook his head, exasperated. "That's not how it works, Pat. Lakes are privately owned all the time, especially when they're entirely contained within someone's property lines. And according to the surveys, this one falls entirely within Emma's boundaries." Patricia scowled but said nothing. Her usual confidence was beginning to crack under the pressure. Other board members floated ideas for compromise, suggesting they negotiate with Emma instead of pursuing litigation. "Maybe we can work something out," offered Sarah Chen, the vice president. "Offer her compensation for the clubhouse lot or propose a shared use agreement for the lake." Patricia shot down the suggestion immediately. "Absolutely not. We're not rewarding her for holding us hostage. We stick to our principles." But cracks were forming within the HOA itself. Several members expressed growing dissatisfaction with Patricia's leadership, questioning her stubbornness and refusal to consider alternative solutions. Behind closed doors, whispers of a potential leadership change began to circulate. As the weeks dragged on, the situation reached a boiling point. The HOA filed a lawsuit against Emma, claiming adverse possession, a legal doctrine that allows someone to gain ownership of property through continuous use over a certain period. Emma's team countered with a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the HOA had never met the strict requirements for such a claim. The legal process was slow and grueling, filled with depositions, hearings, and endless paperwork. But Emma refused to let it consume her. She continued living her life as best she could, tending to her garden, fishing in her lake, and finding moments of peace despite the chaos swirling around her. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma reflected on everything that had happened. She thought about the neighbors who had turned against her, the ones who had apologized, and the countless others caught in the middle. She thought about Patricia, whose pride and determination mirrored her own in many ways. And she thought about the lake, the beautiful, tranquil lake that had started it all. No matter what happened next, she reminded herself, the lake would always belong to her. It was more than just a body of water. It was a symbol of resilience, independence, and the unshakable bond between her and the land she loved. With a deep breath, Emma smiled softly. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them head-on. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the serene beauty of Emma's lake. Rows of wooden benches stretched out beneath fluorescent lights, casting an unforgiving glow over everyone seated inside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the space as people waited for the judge to enter. On one side of the aisle sat Emma Carter, flanked by her lawyer, David Miller. Across from them were representatives of the HOA, including Patricia Reeves, who wore a stiff business suit and clutched a stack of papers like armor. Emma felt a mix of emotions as she glanced around the room. There were familiar faces, neighbors she'd seen at the grocery store or passed on the road, but today they weren't just casual acquaintances. They were adversaries in a legal battle that had consumed months of her life. Some looked nervous, others defiant. But none met her gaze directly. Emma took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here, not just to protect her property, but to defend her legacy. When the judge finally entered, the room fell silent. Judge Linda Hargrove was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. She wasted no time getting down to business. "This case involves a dispute over property ownership," she began, summarizing the situation succinctly. "Ms. Carter claims full ownership of the land, including the lakebed dock and the lot currently occupied by the defendant, the Homeowners Association. The HOA disputes these claims and argues that their use of the property constitutes adverse possession." With those words, the trial officially began. David Miller opened the proceedings with a compelling opening statement. He painted a clear picture of Emma's history with the property, emphasizing how her family had owned the land long before the HOA even existed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complicated matter," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "The facts are simple. Ms. Carter holds legal title to the property in question. The deeds, surveys, and historical records confirm this beyond any reasonable doubt. What we have here is a case of trespass, not rightful ownership." To support his argument, David introduced a series of exhibits, original deeds dating back to the 1950s, recent survey maps showing precise property boundaries, and photographs of Emma's grandparents standing proudly on the same land decades earlier. Each piece of evidence reinforced the undeniable truth. Emma's claim was legitimate. The HOA's lawyer, a slick-talking man named Richard Hayes, countered with a different narrative. He argued that the HOA had been using the land openly and continuously for years, meeting the criteria for adverse possession. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing dramatically, "the law recognizes that prolonged, uninterrupted use can establish ownership. For decades, our clients have maintained the clubhouse, improved the property, and treated it as their own. This cannot be ignored." Richard's presentation relied heavily on emotional appeals, portraying the HOA as a community united by shared goals and values. He called several witnesses to testify about the HOA's contributions to the neighborhood, from organizing holiday parties to maintaining common areas. But despite his efforts to sway the court, his arguments lacked substance when it came to proving actual ownership. Emma took the stand next, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she answered questions under oath. David guided her through her testimony, allowing her to tell her story in her own words. She spoke about growing up on the property, learning to fish with her father, and inheriting the land after her grandparents passed away. Her voice wavered slightly when she described receiving the first letter from the HOA, but she quickly regained composure. "I never imagined I'd find myself in this position," she admitted, looking directly at the judge. "I've always respected my neighbors and valued living in harmony, but I also believe in standing up for what's right. This isn't just about me. It's about protecting something that belongs to my family and ensuring it remains intact for future generations." Her sincerity resonated with the courtroom, earning nods of approval from some spectators. Even a few HOA members seemed moved, their expressions softening as they listened to her heartfelt words. Under cross-examination, Richard tried to poke holes in Emma's testimony, questioning whether she truly understood the complexities of property law. But Emma remained calm and composed, answering each question patiently. When he suggested she might have overlooked certain details in her documentation, she simply replied, "If there are errors, I invite you to point them out. So far, none have been found." As the trial progressed, cracks began to form in the HOA's defense. During his testimony, Mark Thompson, the treasurer, admitted under oath that the HOA had never conducted a thorough title search before purchasing the clubhouse lot. "We assumed the previous owner had clear rights to the property," he explained, glancing nervously at Patricia. "It wasn't until recently that we discovered otherwise." This admission proved devastating for the HOA's case. Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Mr. Thompson," she said sharply, "you're telling me your organization made significant financial decisions without verifying ownership? That seemed reckless." Patricia squirmed in her seat, visibly uncomfortable. When it was her turn to testify, she struggled to maintain her usual confidence. Under questioning from David, she reluctantly acknowledged that the HOA had acted hastily in issuing eviction notices and pursuing legal action against Emma. "We believed we were within our rights," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. By the end of the day, it was clear which side held the stronger position. The HOA's arguments rested on shaky ground, while Emma's case was built on solid evidence and irrefutable facts. After 2 days of testimony, closing arguments, and deliberation, Judge Hargrove delivered her verdict. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers as she reviewed her notes. Finally, she looked up and addressed the parties involved. "Based on the evidence presented," she began, her tone firm and authoritative, "it is abundantly clear that Ms. Carter holds legal title to the property in question. The HOA's claim of adverse possession fails to meet the necessary criteria, as their use of the land cannot be considered exclusive or continuous. Furthermore, their actions demonstrate a lack of due diligence in verifying ownership prior to making improvements or asserting control." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I find in favor of Ms. Carter. The HOA is hereby ordered to vacate the clubhouse lot immediately and cease all unauthorized use of her property. Additionally, they will pay damages for trespassing and legal fees incurred during this process." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Emma exhaled deeply, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. David smiled warmly, patting her shoulder in congratulations. Across the aisle, Patricia's face turned crimson, and several HOA members exchanged panicked looks. Outside the courthouse, reporters jostled for interviews, eager to capture reactions from both sides. Emma declined to speak, preferring to let her victory speak for itself. As she walked to her car, she noticed a few neighbors lingering nearby, watching her with uncertain expressions. One of them, a young mother named Sarah, stepped forward hesitantly. "Emma," she said, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry for everything that happened. We should have listened to you sooner." Tears welled up in her eyes as she extended a hand. "Can we start over?" Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded and shook Sarah's hand. "Of course," she replied softly. "Everyone deserves a second chance." As she drove home, Emma reflected on the journey she'd endured. It hadn't been easy, but it had taught her the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. The lake shimmered in the distance, its waters reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. For the first time in months, Emma felt truly at peace, knowing she had fought and won for what mattered most. The weeks following the court's decision brought a mix of emotions for Emma Carter. On one hand, she felt a deep sense of relief. Finally, the weight of uncertainty had been lifted from her shoulders. The HOA was ordered to vacate the clubhouse lot immediately, and their attempts to challenge the ruling were quickly dismissed by higher courts. Their once confident stance crumbled into quiet resignation as they scrambled to find a new location for their meetings. But on the other hand, Emma couldn't help but feel a lingering sadness about how strained relationships with her neighbors had become. The community that had once seemed so picturesque now bore the scars of division. Some neighbors avoided her altogether, while others shot her wary glances when passing by. It wasn't easy being labeled the woman who took down the HOA, even though Emma hadn't asked for any of this. She simply wanted to live in peace on land that rightfully belonged to her. Still, she understood why tensions ran high. It wasn't every day that people learned their cherished clubhouse sat on someone else's property. Despite the awkwardness, Emma noticed small signs of change in the weeks that followed. A few brave souls began reaching out, offering apologies or attempting to mend fences. One afternoon, as Emma worked in her garden pruning roses, she heard a soft knock at her front door. Opening it, she found Greg, a neighbor who had initially sided with the HOA, standing there holding a basket of fresh-baked cookies. "I know it doesn't fix anything," he said sheepishly, "but I wanted to say I'm sorry." We jumped to conclusions without knowing the whole story. His cheeks flushed red, but his sincerity shone through. Emma accepted the gift with a warm smile. "Thank you, Greg. That means a lot." Moments like these gave her hope. Slowly but surely some neighbors started treating her differently, not as an adversary but as a person. They began inviting her to barbecues and holiday gatherings, tentative steps toward rebuilding trust. Emma appreciated the gestures, though she remained cautious. Not everyone was ready to forgive or forget, and she understood that healing would take time. Meanwhile, the HOA struggled to recover from its defeat. Patricia Reeves resigned shortly after the trial, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew it was more than that. Her leadership style had alienated many members, leaving behind a fractured organization desperate for direction. Sarah Chen, the vice president, stepped up to lead the group temporarily, vowing to rebuild trust both within the HOA and with the broader community. Under Sarah's guidance, the HOA relocated its operations to a smaller facility miles away. Gone were the lavish parties and heated debates. Instead, they focused on practical matters like road maintenance and safety initiatives. While some longtime members grumbled about the downsizing, others welcomed the shift. For the first time in years, the HOA felt less like a battleground and more like a cooperative effort. For Emma, life settled into a quieter rhythm. With the legal battle behind her, she turned her attention back to the things that mattered most: her home, her lake, and the natural beauty surrounding her. Yet something inside her had shifted during the ordeal. She realized that owning such a special piece of land came with responsibility, not just to preserve it, but to share it wisely. One crisp morning, as sunlight danced across the water, Emma stood on the dock reflecting on her next move. She loved her solitude, but she also understood the value of connection. Over the years, she'd seen families picnicking near the lake, children laughing as they skipped stones, and couples walking hand in hand along the shore. These moments reminded her of the joy her property could bring to others, if managed responsibly. Inspired by these memories, Emma decided to transform part of her land into a small, eco-friendly retreat. The idea took shape gradually. Visitors could book stays in rustic cabins scattered around the perimeter of the lake, each designed to blend seamlessly with the environment. Activities would focus on conservation and mindfulness, guided hikes, birdwatching tours, and workshops on sustainable living. By opening her doors to guests, Emma hoped to foster a deeper appreciation for nature while ensuring her property remained protected. Word of the retreat spread quickly, thanks in part to local media coverage of her legal victory. People were curious about the woman who had stood up to the HOA and won. Many admired her courage and determination, and soon reservations began pouring in. Families, couples, and solo travelers arrived seeking respite from the chaos of modern life. They marveled at the serene waters, lush forests, and star-filled skies unobscured by city lights. What surprised Emma most, however, was how much she enjoyed hosting them. Watching visitors reconnect with nature reignited her own passion for the land. She often joined guests on morning walks, sharing stories about the history of the area and teaching them how to identify native plants and animals. In return, they shared their own stories of challenges overcome, dreams pursued, and lessons learned. These interactions reminded Emma that even in solitude, human connection had its place. As months turned into years, Emma's retreat became a beloved destination. Neighbors who had once viewed her with suspicion now praised her efforts to create something positive for the community. Even former HOA members stopped by occasionally, marveling at how beautifully the land had been preserved. Though not everyone fully reconciled with Emma, the animosity faded into the background, replaced by mutual respect. Looking back, Emma realized the fight with the HOA had changed her in ways she never expected. It taught her resilience, patience, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. More importantly, it showed her the power of forgiveness and second chances. By choosing to open her heart and her land to others, she found a renewed sense of purpose. On quiet evenings, Emma still sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The lake shimmered. In the distance, its surface calm and inviting. For all the turmoil she'd endured, one thing remained constant: this place was hers. And now, It was also a haven for those seeking solace, inspiration, and a reminder of the beauty that exists when we work together. Emma smiled softly, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Life by the lake wasn't perfect. It never had been. But it was exactly where she was meant to be.